Barry, thank you so much for joining me on the Public Sector Marketing Show. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Joanne.
So, listen, you are leading out on the government's digital transformation agenda. And let's start with the government's digital strategy and ambitions. How would you sum them up?
Wow, how long have you got? Um, well, really, the Connecting Government 2030 document, which was published last month, sets out six priority action areas, four core design principles, and it effectively leads to four key outcomes. So, what are the four key outcomes? They're services, digital government services that are fast, intuitive, and the public will enjoy using them and choose to use them, which is important. Secondly, that they're trusted, secure, and inclusive. The third, which is really important to us, is they're developed through collaboration and very much value focused. And when we talk about that, we mean collaboration with the users themselves, but also collaboration with other government bodies. In other words, reuse where possible rather than reinvent. And then the fourth thing is that they become foundation stones for additional value, whether that's the data they create or whatever that happens to be. So, I mean, we can go into the design principles and so on if you like, but broadly speaking, that's the main focus of the strategy. It's very much in that space that we saw the years between 2016 and now as building strong foundations for being a more digital government. So in that space was things like the gov.ie portal, the growth of MyGovID, building the underlying infrastructure, creating important legislation like the Data Sharing and Governance Act. So we've done all those things now. So now it's about, okay, we've really built ourselves up now to really push on, and let's talk about how we do that and set out plans for doing that.
So I work with Google on their advanced digital marketing masterclasses for their clients. And one tool that they have developed in conjunction with the Boston Consulting Group is the digital maturity benchmark, right? So it talks about how digitally mature organizations are from nascent to micro moment, and micro moment being most mature. Now, sidelining that kind of framework, how digitally mature do you think the Irish government is in comparison to other countries across Europe?
Well, there's a very complicated answer to that, but we do know the answer. In the EU, they use what's called the Digital Economic Society Index, DESI, and that measures a number of things, but it effectively seeks to measure the digital health of your country. Now it looks at things like infrastructure, small business, public appetite for digital, and so on. But on that, Ireland at first sight is in a really, really good position. We're fifth, and we're up there with the Scandinavians and the Netherlands. But actually, when you drill down and look at digital government services, we're 16th, so we're not so good. And the reason for that is that they look into the sectors as well as central government. So if we look purely at the departments and people's experience of those, broadly we're pretty good there. We'd be one of the better ones. But when you look into health and local government and so on, it gets a lot more patchy. And that's what they do, of course. And I think the challenge, specifically the one that's set out in our national digital strategy, Harnessing Digital, is about the whole of public service raises its game, not just a department or an agency.
And one study that I love, it came from McKinsey in 2018, and they looked at why customer experience wasn't as good in public sector as it was in private sector. And this was a global study. And one of the factors they said was a monopolistic mindset, whereby government would say, we will provide services to you how we dictate, how, what suits us. But in your very opening statement there, and one of those key outcomes, you said delivering a public service that how the public want to receive it. So that is hugely refreshing. And you also mentioned that European framework that measures digital health and the complexity of multiple agencies within government and not just one government agency. So How do you transgress that hurdle of bringing all of government together to streamline the delivery of public service when you have different people heading different departments, different cultures, different mindsets, different skill sets? I mean, is it your job to bring all of this together, and how are you trying to achieve it?
Yeah, it is my job, and maybe just explain that the National Digital Strategy aligns to the EU Digital Decade. So the EU have set out targets for 2030 broadly across four areas, which are digital business, digital infrastructure, digital skills, and digital government. Now, those four areas feed off each other and they're interdependent. But in the Harnessing Digital, the National Digital Strategy, I'm the senior responsible owner, if you like, for the digital government quadrant. Now, I have interest in all of the areas, and I'm on the senior officers group that looks after them all. So broadly, what we've tried to do with our strategy is play into that area, which means by delivering our strategy, we're delivering against the whole 2030 framework. So that gives me, I guess, an element of influence, because digital government is everything that we touch relating to government. Just on your McKinsey quote, I think they oversimplify it. I think there's two big differences between government and the private sector when we look at digital. The first one is we're not in competition, really. So if Aer Lingus create a much better digital customer experience, then Ryanair will respond, or vice versa, and likewise in retail and all of those areas that we look at. But government doesn't necessarily have a competitor in that space. But then where we're different is everybody's our customer, and we want everybody to be happy. So if you decide you want to open an Amazon account and you don't have access to technology and you don't have a credit card, they'll say, thanks very much, Joanne, but maybe you should just walk down your high street. Whereas government, we will say, of course, we'll provide you with the services that you need, whether that's digital, assisted digital, or face-to-face. So to answer your question, the way you get everybody on board is you start with the user outcome. And so you can call these principles, I tend to actually call them truths, because I think a truth is something that's much bigger than a principle. So for example, everyone having the right to the same quality of government service, that's just the truth. You don't talk about principles when it's something as important as that, or the right to privacy, or any of those things. So what we have said is that the digital expenditure, the digital strategy should benefit every person who lives in Ireland, and indeed people in the diaspora who rely on digital government services. And by that, what we mean is that someone like yourself who prefers to go digital first, then you should get a really good experience, the best experience that we can give you. But if we achieve our objective by 2030, that 90% of people are following the same journey as you are, then we should also then use the resources we're freeing up to give a better experience to the 10%. So as everybody benefits from government going in that space. And when you start talking in that way, it's very difficult to argue with that. And it's very difficult to argue with principles like people should only tell us something about them once, that they've changed their address and so on. They shouldn't try and have to remember how many touch points they've got with government. That all should be taken care of with them. They should only really have to identify themselves to government once when they're using a service. They shouldn't have 15 or 16 different logons and passwords to remember and all of those sorts of things. And so it's by looking at the user journey map, we can start then to go backwards and look at the services that they need and how we provide them more consistently and better. And I think the government took a really courageous decision when gov.ie was established a few years ago now, because they said not only was it going to be the front door to government services, it's going to be the room for government services as well. And so what we did during that period and through that plan, working with Taoiseach's department and the departments themselves, when we were moving content over, we were reviewing it, and we were basically making sure it was intuitive to people with learning difficulties, with language difficulties, and so on. So we were completely rethinking how government communicated with its people, um, and that got huge support, and people accepted then across public service that doing it in this way, in a consistent way, where all the things you searched for, you followed the same mechanism, was the right way to do it. And so all we're really doing is extending that to many of the actual systems themselves.
You've kind of already answered my next question in terms of what role does your team play in terms of digital communications? Because obviously that's kind of the area of transformation that I'm interested in. And I've seen, and I, as a kind of an expert or a nerd in this area, whatever you want to call me, I watch on the outside and I've seen the evolution. And particularly through the pandemic, government has proved its agility and its willingness to adapt under huge stressful situations. But that evidence can now be taken and can be scaled. And so, from a communications point of view, you mentioned gov.ie. Are you acutely aware of the importance of that line of communication between public and government?
Absolutely, Joanne. And in fact, one of the best hires I think I ever made was to bring in a couple of journalists to work with us on gov.ie, because what we were finding was that we had, and I'm talking here generally as the government or public service, we had a very specific prescriptive way of communicating with our stakeholders. In other words, we communicated with the person in the street in exactly the same way as we would communicate with a minister or a journalist. And so what we did was, as part of creating the digital spaces, if you like, that the gov.ie is made up of, and migrating departments into those, we then provide them with advice as to how they might rethink and re-profile their content. And that was invaluable. And we actually worked with a couple of the departments, and we we brought in with where their customers were, and we bribed them with coffee and donuts, and we actually asked them to try the user journey map in the old way of doing things and in the new way. And 90, 100% of time, they preferred the new way, simply because it was written with them in mind. It actually sketched out their journey and tried to, um, at every step of the way, make it easy for them to find the next step. So actually, where we're going over the next few years with digital government is to bring them into the center of everything that we do and try and really get them to tell us what they like or not. And by the way, gov.ie, we experimented with that. I remember the team and we picked what we thought were the 3 or 4 best early adopters of this way of working across Europe and globally. And we showed them to a group of Irish people with our own prototype, and they all liked our own prototype better. They liked the simplicity of it. They liked the harp. There was things which they said, no, keep that in. That makes me feel safe. And it's interesting, you'll know this as a marketing expert, but this was all new to us, that those little things, those little nuances really change how people feel about engaging with a particular site. And I guess, although there was an element of necessity, the proof of the pudding was in the eating, because in 2019, we were very happy. We'd got 6 million visits to gov.ie. In 2020, for obvious reasons, it was 100 million. But what that actually taught us was people were listening to the Taoiseach speak on the news, and they were following up on gov.ie, or possibly simultaneously, and getting the detail of the information. And often the Taoiseach was talking about gov.ie as well, and government communications were as well. They were seeing it as being the communications tool of choice because it was so fast, it could be changed quickly, and so on.
I absolutely agree. Like, I've lost count of how many times listening to radio shows. Radio is my kind of chosen medium, of journalists and presenters referring to gov.ie, speaking to ministers, or, well, that hasn't been updated on the website, or it has been updated, or, this is new information. And that level of trust is very important, because as arbiters of the truth. And it was a changing landscape almost daily in some instances. People really needed to go somewhere, and so your prototype definitely worked out. So did your experiment with hitting 100 million views. But let's talk about, you obviously have to champion transformation, and transformation comes in many forms, and there's many facets to it, like strategy, implementation plans, milestones, and all of this good stuff. But a lot of it also comes down to, you know, people shifting their mindsets and being willing to change their work processes and embrace new ways of working in technology. So, how do you champion transformation within the team and within the people within the government?
Well, what we try and do, what I try and do, is persuade them to own the outcome, to find the direction of travel as compelling as I personally do. And the best way to do that is often to co-create with them. So we run the governance structure for digital government, and there's a number of different uh, structures involved in that. But often we'll sit down with our wider stakeholder group and try and design the direction of travel with them and get their support. So, for example, when the first strategy was produced in 2015, I arrived in 2016. We worked for 2 intensive days with the heads of IT in all government departments and built what was then called the 18-step plan, which was, in other words, a strategy is one thing, but we want to feel in 3 years we've progressed it in all the key areas. And so these 18 steps focused on the 5 key elements of the strategy and set outcomes that we would achieve in all of those. And we did that. We drove all of those and we involved them in the governance. So getting shared ownership of the vision is a really important part of change. We're also lucky that we have, or I have in my unit, what's called the Digital Government Oversight Unit. So we get to see investments as they're coming in. And that can often mean saying, well, this is a good idea, but we would like you to rethink how you're doing this or how you're doing that. So a great example of that was the National Childcare Scheme, where when they first approached us about the digital solution, and I would applaud what they did there, because they started off with the user journey, which meant that they focused very much on the digital solution, and they knew a very large proportion of their client base, i.e., people with young children, would be digital natives. So when they talked us through their journey, we said, but why don't you use MyGov ID? Because a lot of people who will be using your service will already be in the receipt of child benefit, and they'll have all of this personal architecture and so on available to them. And they supported that, and that was a huge success. So sometimes using the opportunity of having that oversight of what the departments are planning to do and talking to them about how they might do it in a more aligned and strategic way, it's a great opportunity for us as well.
We touched on the pandemic, but what impact did the pandemic have on expediting transformation within government? Google say that we experienced a decade of transformation in 12 months. Would you concur with that within your own business of government?
Absolutely. We saw growth in all of the digital government services, but I think more importantly, we actually saw a mind shift in people. So a lot of people who would have said, I could never see myself doing that, all of a sudden they did it, and they found out it was relatively easy. So things like PUP payments and so on, which were very quickly created as online services, the adoption rate on them was huge. But I guess the one closest to my heart was the digital COVID certificate, because we had to very quickly engage with many stakeholders and get them to be part of a completely different way of thinking, which was to help the country return to some form of normality post-lockdown. And so we started off with this EU regulation which related to travel, and we very quickly moved to getting a minimum data set from the HSE and the Department of Health to using the cloud to create this certificate, which was effectively a proof that something had happened to you, but it was a proof that you wanted. It wasn't government developing this for its own reasons. It was meeting a need because you wanted to travel, so we give you this proof. And then, of course, hospitality opened up, and we created a minimum data set that if someone was checking your certificate in a bar or a coffee shop, they would only see the minimum data set and so on. So all of those things really help people to understand the power of digital. And so now when you talk about where we would like to be is let someone have a digital driving license on their phone and a digital insurance certificate and not have to remember to carry these paper artifacts with them everywhere they go. They get it immediately. They say, that's like when I had the digital COVID certificate on my phone. And of course, the other huge development in that was the pan-European dimension, because the EU had been talking about cross-border services for a while. And then all of a sudden, just in a period of months, you could go to Italy and you could show your Irish digital COVID certificate, and they knew you'd been vaccinated, or they knew you'd been tested or recovered, or whatever that happened to be. So that was a really powerful example of where government used the pandemic to do not just immediate things, but things which will serve us well in the longer term as well.
So, what about the changing demographic in the workplace as well? You spoke about parents potentially being digital natives when it came to the national childcare scheme, but I have a sense that with millennials and Gen Z generation filling up our workplaces now, that are they somewhat of a catalyst for internal digital transformation? You've got young doctors coming into hospitals, when they live their lives through their smartphone, and then suddenly they're faced with maybe a paper trail and filing cabinets and porters walking around hospitals. So do you think that, that intergenerational kind of paradigm shift and pressure point is having a positive impact on digital transformation within government more broadly?
Yeah, I must be careful what I say here, because I remember going to a coffee shop in Malahide, and there were two senior citizens in the queue in front of me, and they both took out their smartphones and had their digital COVID certificates scanned and went in quite happily. So I think it's more a question of desire than age. But yeah, I mean, we're seeing, I guess, differences in preference as to how digital government services are used. We're also seeing changes in preferences to how people work, of course, which is the other big thing, which is being debated post-COVID. Are we going to return to the way it's always been, or are we completely reimagining a new way of working? And certainly the younger ones in particular want to reimagine a new way of working. And so that's going to be a challenge for us, because a lot of these people are the talent that we need to continue the pace of evolution that we've got. And so we need to facilitate them to give of their best. And that means we need to think differently. But what we're seeing in terms of how we advance the digital agenda, they're bringing very specific ideas on how to do things. So they understand blockchain and they understand artificial intelligence and so on. But ultimately, really good innovation comes from people who understand the business, and they understand the blockages, and they understand where there's poor customer experience. So I think that there's room for us all in this digital transformation. And I think we are talking about transformation over the next few years, not just the evolution. That won't cut it. We need something bigger. And I think that will challenge us as a country as well about our digital aptitude. It's not enough to think a bit like, you mentioned doctors. If a percentage of your people are training to be doctors and nurses, well, then that should cover your future needs. But actually with digital, it's different, because it's just going to be so many jobs are going to be dependent on a degree of competence and aptitude. And then we're going to need to grow the talent to continue to make Ireland a desirable place to invest and to start up business and all of those things.
And there's one common denominator that binds all of this together when we talk about digital transformation and that's data governance. And there's been many, many discussions and debates, and we've had new legislation, and still governments need to copper fasten their legislation as technology changes. But as CIO, you are the guardian of the data and the governance piece, and so you seem to come to this with a level of confidence, but also a level of respect for the public. And there's definitely a meeting in the middle. So there's protecting data, respecting data, but giving the public what they need and what they demand. So is that something that you think we've figured out, the data governance piece?
I think it's starting to be recognized, actually worldwide, that Ireland, regardless of which government has been in power, has always treated data respectfully and carefully. And when you look at the most recent OECD report on trust, what emerged was that our public service in Ireland is up with Denmark and Finland and so on, the most trusted in Europe. That how the public trusts public service in Ireland with their data is amongst the highest in Europe and so on. Ireland's top quite right quadrant for virtually everything. And I think what that demonstrates is that way back, probably several years ago, when the Data Sharing and Governance Act was first in inception, the desire was that Ireland wasn't just a digital leader, but it led Europe's thinking in terms of stewardship of data as well. And one of the outputs of the Data Sharing and Governance Act is that every data sharing agreement for data sharing that takes place between departments in Ireland will actually be put out to public consultation and will be published. In other words, it's entirely transparent. And OECD have publicly said that Ireland is one of the most forward-thinking countries in the world in this space, because they know the Data Sharing and Governance Act very well. They actually sit in the Data Governance Board as a critical friend. So I think where we're going with this is a really exciting and open place. And I'm not taking all the personal credit for that. A lot of ministers and so on worked really, really hard, and legislators to get us to where we are today. It's my job now to make sure that we implement all the things that we talked about, and we're making great progress. The Data Governance Board is up and running, and it's going through the process now of agreeing and approving the data sharing agreements that are coming in from the various departments. So we're in a very healthy position, but I think let's not get complacent about it. Let's keep that appetite for change and leadership going.
And of course, I think it's important to reiterate that trust is earned. You just don't get trust overnight. So that trust has been earned with the public through years and years, and that constant communication and telling the people and consulting with the people of what you're doing, and it really stands to. So yeah, I think it's really nice to hear where we are standing on a European leaderboard, but also within our own country and how people trust us. But on the theme of innovation, you're also within your own department hosting Innovation Week. And I know it's at the early stages and you can't disclose too many details, but what can you say? And maybe you want to make an appeal to maybe some of the listeners to the show to maybe put some of their projects forward, because I often find, and this is why I have this show, is that I find that a really great case study is a great way to tell a story. And very often they're not very good at coming forward and shouting about themselves. So I kind of like to get people on the show and say, let's talk about the achievements that you had. So what do you want to say about Innovation Week? You can kind of plug it now as if you're on the Late Late Show.
Okay, well, it's on the 24th to the 28th of October. That's the first thing to say. I think actually the second thing to say is I think innovation is sometimes a misunderstood term. And I bang on about this quite a lot. Innovation isn't invention. And it's not done by geniuses on their own and so on. It's done by teams of people, and it's actually problem solving. It's this desire to go through all your processes and say, are there imperfections in those, and are there ways in which we can fix them? And sometimes little fixes by someone who just knows this little part of the process can make a difference to the whole service. So I would appeal to people that you don't need any qualifications, you don't need to be a techie person, you don't need to be a certain grade, you don't need to be a certain age. Innovation is something that anybody who cares about the service they provide can do, because they'll know through their knowledge of the service that there's things that they can do to fix them. Now, one of the other things we're going to try and encourage over the next year, we might talk about it more in Innovation Week, but it's another personal, I guess, thing of mine. And that is that I've become very aware in this role that we have some brilliant startup and SME capability in Ireland, but sometimes they're very frustrated because they don't always get an avenue into public service to test some of their thinking. And so we're going to try and open up a capability where they can almost submit their ideas for improvement, because you would know yourself, a lot of startups can be someone who maybe worked in the health service, who really wanted to change something, and they knew someone that worked in tech, and they come together and they start up this company for change. That's where a lot of it comes from, just the pure passion of being involved in the service, and seeing where you might fix it. And so we want to create opportunities for those sorts of solutions to get their way into government. And those ones that really look like that they're working, we believe that there's the procurement vehicles available to us that we can not just build them into prototypes, but actually build them into sustainable solutions. So that's a very exciting opportunity that we're hoping to launch around the Innovation Week, but then really take forward over the next couple of years.
And is there a particular website that people need to go to? Obviously, gov.ie, right? But is there a landing page that you have, or how will we signpost people? I'll put the link in the blog post then. In
I
the
think I think the link in the blog's the best way to get through to it,
no
Joanne.
worries, I'll do that. But listen, final question. So maybe we have CMO or CIO colleagues in government and public sector, even outside of Ireland, listening to this, and with all your experience, what what three tips would you give to them on how they can scale digital transformation in complex organizations? How have you kind of, what have you learned that you can share on and pass on to your peers?
Well, the first one's always, it starts with the user. Um, I often use that quote by Steve Jobs where he says, even him in Apple realized that starting with the technology was pointless. You had to start with the user journey or the user requirement. So start with the user. I think we have a motto in OGCIO, which would be the second one, which is earn the right to ask for more. In other words, just because you have a good idea, don't end up pumping hundreds and thousands into it hoping something happens. Work out a way which you can start small and very quickly demonstrate the benefits, whether that's prototyping or a modular approach. And of course, agile lends itself extremely well, and we use agile in OGCIO to do that. So that would be the second one. And third is, no idea is a bad one. Every idea merits some form of more detailed exploration, because people get frightened to submit ideas, as I said, because they think ideas are the role of the most senior in the organization, or whatever that happens to be. But actually, it's often the ideas that come from the person who's closest to the point of service that are the best ones.
Oh, great tips. Listen, Barry, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for your time. And it's been really refreshing. And I think you've given people some really good insights in behind the door of digital transformation in Ireland's government. So thanks very much, and best of luck with Innovation Week.
Thank you, Joanne. It's been lovely to talk to you, and hopefully we'll see some people in person at some of the Innovation Week events. And if they're there, come over and say hello.
Wouldn't that be innovative now, an in-person event?
Indeed.